The wind howled through the San Juan Mountains like a dying animal, tearing at the frayed canvas that stood between three freezing children and the brutal Colorado winter. Clara clutched her youngest to her chest, feeling his tiny, shivering breaths begin to slow. They had been stripped of their home, their dignity, and their father, left to perish in the merciless wild by men whose greed knew no bounds. Hope was a luxury she had buried weeks ago. Then, a massive shadow filled the tier in their tent. A stranger wrapped in thick furs, with eyes like chipped flint, stared down at the desperate family. He didn't offer empty pity. He offered a promise. The year was 1883, and the unforgiving frontier of southwestern Colorado was not a place for a widow, let alone one burdened with three young children. Clara Higgins sat huddled in the center of a patched, leaking canvas tent, the only sanctuary she had left in a world that had violently turned its back on her. Outside, the November frost was hardening the mud of the Animas River Valley into jagged, unyielding ridges. The pines groaned under the weight of an early, heavy snow, and the temperature was dropping with a terrifying speed. Clara pulled the threadbare wool blanket tighter around 3-year-old Toby, whose deep, rattling cough had been worsening for 2 days. On her left, 7-year-old Abigail was curled into a tight ball, her lips carrying a faint, frightening tinge of blue. 10-year-old Levi, the oldest, sat near the flap of the tent, stubbornly clutching a rusted iron fire poker. He was trying so desperately to be the man of the house, a role thrust upon him far too soon. "Mama," Abigail whispered, her voice barely carrying over the wind snapping at the canvas. "Are we going to freeze?" "No, sweet girl," Clara lied, her voice steady despite the crushing despair in her chest. "The storm will pass by morning. We just have to hold out a little longer." But Clara knew the bitter truth. They were not going to survive another night out here. Their meager supply of firewood had been reduced to a handful of damp twigs, and the last of their dried beans had been eaten 2 days ago. They were slowly starving, freezing to death in the shadow of the mountains that had claimed her husband, Arthur. Arthur Higgins had been a good man, a hard-working prospector who had moved his family west with dreams of striking a modest claim and building a legacy. He had been close, too. Just weeks before his death, Arthur had come back to their small timber cabin with fire in his eyes, speaking in hushed, excited tones about a quartz vein he had discovered up near Engineer Mountain. But before he could officially file the claim in Durango, tragedy struck. The local sheriff reported it as a simple mining accident, a tunnel collapse that buried Arthur under tons of unyielding rock. But Clara had seen the way Harrison Gentry, a wealthy and ruthless land speculator, had looked at Arthur in the days leading up to his death. Gentry owned half the saloons and supply lines in the territory, but his true wealth came from bullying independent miners off lucrative claims. 2 days after Arthur was put in the ground, Gentry arrived at Clara's door with a forged ledger, claiming Arthur owed his mercantile an insurmountable debt. With the local law firmly in Gentry's deep pockets, Clara was given 24 hours to vacate her home. They took the cabin, the mules, and even her husband's tools, driven out into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a surplus army tent. Clara had been forced to drag her children into the unforgiving wilderness just to escape Gentry's creeping threats that he might take the children in as indentured labor to pay off the remaining debt. Now, sitting in the freezing dark, Clara felt the agonizing weight of failure. She had tried to hike them toward Silverton, hoping to find a charity house or a church that would take them in, but the early blizzard had trapped them in this jagged valley. "Levi," Clara said softly, her breath pluming in the freezing air. "Come away from the flap. Come huddle with us. We need to share the warmth." Levi hesitated, his small knuckles white around the heavy iron poker. "I gotta keep watch, Mama. I heard something moving out there in the brush." Heavy steps. Clara's blood ran cold. The San Juan Mountains were teeming with mountain lions, black bears desperately foraging before hibernation, and timber wolves. She carefully laid Toby down, wrapping him in her own shawl, and moved toward her son. She peered through the crack in the canvas. The night was pitch black, illuminated only by the faint, eerie glow of the snow. The wind was deafening, but beneath the howling gusts, Clara felt a deep, rhythmic vibration in the earth. A snapping branch echoed like a gunshot through the trees. Something large was circling their camp. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She reached out and pulled Levi behind her, taking the heavy iron poker from his trembling hands. "Get back with your sister," she ordered, her voice brooking no argument. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the thin canvas, so close that Clara could smell the foul, rancid breath of the animal. It was a bear, a massive, starving grizzly drawn down from the higher elevations by the scent of their desperation and the faint, lingering smell of their empty bean tins. The tent fabric bowed inward as a massive weight pressed against it. Abigail screamed. The heavy canvas suddenly ripped with a sickening tear, and a massive claw, thick as a man's wrist, slashed through the darkness. The brutal cold rushed in, accompanied by the terrifying, hulking silhouette of a predator ready to claim its final meal before the long winter. Clara raised the iron poker, stepping in front of her screaming children, ready to die to buy them just a few more seconds of life. Just as the grizzly lunged, tearing the remaining canvas aside with a deafening roar, a sharp, echoing crack split the night air. It wasn't the boom of a rifle, but the sharp, terrifying crack of a heavy bullwhip. The bear roared in sudden pain and confusion, twisting away from the ruined tent. Through the shredded opening, Clara saw a figure emerge from the blinding snow. He was a giant of a man, clad in thick, weather-beaten buckskin and heavy furs that made him look like a part of the mountain itself. He didn't shoot. Instead, the man moved with a terrifying, calculated grace. He cracked the whip again, the leather biting into the snow right at the grizzly's paws. In his other hand, he held a thick, blazing torch made of pitch-soaked pine. He thrust the fire directly toward the bear's face, letting out a bellowing, guttural shout that sounded less human and more like the roar of an apex predator challenging a rival. The bear, startled by the fire, the blinding pain of the whip, and the sheer audacity of the challenger, swiped at the air once more before turning its massive bulk and crashing away into the dark. Snow-choked pines. Silence fell over the camp, save for the howling wind and the ragged sobbing of little Abigail. The stranger stood perfectly still for a moment, listening to the retreating heavy footsteps of the bear to ensure it wasn't circling back. Then he slowly lowered the torch and turned his gaze toward the ruined tent. Clara stood frozen, the heavy iron poker still raised above her head, her chest heaving. She stared at the man. Beneath the brim of a snow-caked slouch hat, his face was weathered leather, lined by years of harsh sun and biting wind. A thick, dark beard obscured his jaw, but his eyes, a striking, pale gray, locked onto hers. There was a dangerous wildness in him, an untamed aura that made Clara grip her makeshift weapon tighter. "You can put the iron down, ma'am," the man said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble, surprisingly quiet and calm. "Unless you plan on stoking a fire, you ain't got." Clara didn't lower the poker. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking violently from both the adrenaline and the freezing cold. The man slowly stepped forward, pushing the ruined canvas aside to get a better look at the interior. His pale eyes swept over the pathetic scene, the lack of provisions, the blue-lipped children, the mother standing ready to fight a bear with a stick. Something shifted in his hardened expression, a flicker of deep, profound understanding. "Name's Jedediah Boone," he said, keeping his movements slow and deliberate so as not to spook her further. "Folks in the valleys just call me Jed. I was tracking that old silver-tip grizzly. He's been acting erratic, hungry, tracked him right to your camp." Jedediah paused, looking at the torn canvas, flapping violently in the wind. The temperature inside the tent was dropping rapidly, matching the deadly cold outside. He looked at little Toby, who had broken into another fit of deep, wet coughing. "You can't stay here," Jedediah stated, his tone shifting from casual to commanding. "This tent is dead, and if you stay in this snow, you and your little ones will be too before the sun comes up." "We have nowhere else to go," Clara fired back, her protective instincts warring with her utter exhaustion. "We were driven out of Durango. I won't let another man drag us into the dark to finish the job." Jedediah stopped. He looked at Clara, really looked at her. He saw the fierce, unbroken spirit of a mother buried under layers of grief and ice. He had spent 15 years living alone in these high ranges, avoiding the towns, the greed, and the complicated cruelty of civilized men. He had intended to chase the bear away and keep moving. But looking at the boy trying to shield his sister, and the mother ready to die for them. A long, dormant instinct flared within his chest. He stepped fully into the ruins of the tent, towering over Clara. He didn't reach for his rifle, nor did he make a threatening move. He just looked down at her shivering family. "Ma'am," Jedediah said, his voice dropping to a gentle, steady timbre that cut through the roaring wind. "I don't know who ran you out, and I don't care. But the mountain doesn't negotiate. You are freezing. Your boy there is sick." He reached down and easily hoisted little Toby into his massive, fur-clad arms. Clara gasped and stepped forward, but Jedediah simply tucked the boy inside the thick, warm layer of his bearskin coat, shielding him from the wind. Toby instantly leaned into the radiating heat of the giant man. Jedediah looked back at Clara, his gray eyes resolute. "You'll sleep under a roof tonight," he said. "Gather whatever you need to carry. We're leaving." Clara looked at her shivering daughter and her brave, terrified son. She had no choice. She dropped the iron poker. "Levi, grab your sister's hand," she instructed, her voice breaking. The trek was a brutal, waking nightmare. The snow was up to Clara's knees, and the wind fought them for every inch. Jedediah led the way, breaking the trail with his massive strides, carrying Toby in one arm, and practically dragging Abigail along with his other hand to keep her moving. Clara followed closely behind with Levi, using the path Jedediah cleared. They hiked for what felt like hours, ascending a steep, treacherous game trail that wound through a narrow canyon. Just as Clara felt her legs giving out, ready to collapse into the inviting numb sleep of hypothermia, a faint orange glow appeared through the heavy timber. It was a cabin. Not a flimsy prospector's shack, but a fortress built of massive, hand-hewn logs, tucked seamlessly into the rock face of the mountain. It was sheltered from the wind, practically invisible, unless you knew exactly where to look. Jedediah kicked the heavy oak door open and ushered them inside. The contrast was shocking. The interior was awash in the golden, radiating heat of a massive stone fireplace. The smell of dried herbs, smoked venison, and burning pine filled the air. It was a bachelor's sanctuary, Spartan, organized, and rugged, but to Clara, it was a palace. Jedediah immediately set Toby down on a large bear rug near the hearth. He began tossing thick woolen blankets to Clara, Levi, and Abigail. "Strip the wet clothes," he ordered, turning his back to them to give them privacy, as he stoked the fire into a roaring blaze. "Wrap yourselves in the wool. I'll get a broth going." Clara moved mechanically, stripping her shivering children of their icy, stiff garments and wrapping them in the heavy, rough wool. For the first time in weeks, she felt the terrifying grip of the cold begin to loosen. As she sat by the fire, pulling Levi and Abigail close, she watched the mountain man move around his kitchen area. He was incredibly efficient, handling cast iron pots with massive, calloused hands. Yet, despite his intimidating size and wild appearance, there was a quiet gentleness in his movements. Within minutes, he handed Clara a steaming tin cup of rich, salty venison bone broth. She drank it too fast, tears finally spilling hot down her freezing cheeks as the warmth hit her empty stomach. Jedediah knelt beside Toby, carefully lifting the boy's head and spooning the broth into his mouth. "He's got a congestion deep in the chest," Jedediah noted, pressing a large hand to the boy's forehead. "I've got some willow bark and mullein leaf. I'll brew a tea. It'll break the fever by morning." Clara watched him, entirely bewildered. "Why are you helping us, Mr. Boone?" Jedediah didn't look up from the boy. "Out here, survival ain't a solitary game, missus." "Higgins," Clara said softly. "Clara Higgins." Jedediah's hand stopped mid-motion. The spoon clattered slightly against the tin cup. He slowly turned his head, his gray eyes locking onto Clara with a sudden, intense sharpness that made her breath catch. "Higgins?" Jedediah repeated, his voice dropping an octave. "Your husband. Was his name Arthur?" Clara's eyes widened in shock. "Yes. How could you possibly know that?" Jedediah stood up slowly, his towering frame casting a long, dancing shadow across the log walls. He walked over to a heavy wooden chest at the foot of his bed, unlocked it with an iron key from his neck, and pulled out a leather-bound journal. He walked back and handed it to Clara. Clara recognized it instantly. It was Arthur's ledger, the one he always carried in his breast pocket, the one that was supposed to be buried with him. "I found that 2 weeks ago," Jedediah said quietly, his jaw tightening. Laying in the dirt near an old logging road, a mile away from where a man was buried in a cave-in. Clara opened the journal with trembling hands. On the last page, hastily scribbled in Arthur's handwriting, was a frantic message. If anything happens to me, it was Gentry. He found out about the vein. He sent his thugs. Tell Clara I love her. The map is hidden in the writing abruptly trailed off in a smear of dark, dried blood. Clara gasped, dropping the book as if it burned her. He was murdered, she choked out, the horrifying confirmation of her darkest fears crashing down on her. Yes, ma'am, Jedediah said grimly, and the men who did it are still looking for what he found. For 3 days, the blizzard raged outside the cabin, locking them in a suspended reality. Inside the sturdy log walls, however, a strange, fragile peace had settled over the unlikely group. Under Jedediah's care, Toby's fever broke. The boy was now sitting up, chewing happily on a piece of dried venison, his laughter echoing softly in the warm room. Abigail had taken to trailing Jedediah around the cabin like a tiny shadow. The massive mountain man, who had lived in total isolation for over a decade, displayed a surprising patience. He showed Abigail how to braid sweetgrass, and he spent an entire afternoon teaching Levi how to safely whittle a piece of soft pine into the shape of a hawk, guiding the boy's hands with his own large, scarred fingers. Clara watched it all with a complex knot tightening in her chest. She had spent the last month fighting off men who wanted to ruin her, learning to view every stranger as a threat. Yet here was a man who looked like a savage, showing her children more fatherly tenderness than they had seen since Arthur's death. On the 4th evening, the wind finally died down. The cabin was quiet, the children asleep on the thick rugs near the fire. Clara sat at the heavy oak table, staring at Arthur's blood-stained journal in the flickering lantern light. Jedediah walked over, placing a fresh cup of hot chicory coffee in front of her. He pulled up a chair across the table, the wood groaning under his weight. "You haven't slept much," Jedediah noted, his voice a low rumble. "Every time I close my eyes, I see Harrison Gentry's face," Clara confessed, her voice tight. "I see him taking my home. And now, knowing he ordered Arthur's murder, I feel so utterly helpless, Mr. Boone." "Jed," he corrected gently. He leaned forward, resting his massive forearms on the table. "You aren't helpless, Clara. You kept your children alive in a storm that would have killed grown men. You stood down a starving grizzly with a piece of iron. You've got more sand in you than half the deputies in Durango." Clara looked up, surprised by the genuine respect in his eyes. A faint flush crept into her cheeks. "Why do you stay out here, Jed? Alone in the ice?" Jedediah looked away, staring into the flames of the hearth. A heavy silence stretched between them, thick with ghosts. "I wasn't always alone," Jedediah finally said, the gravel in his voice thickening with old pain. 15 years ago, I had a wife. A small farm down near the New Mexico border. A man came to town. A banker, dealing in railroad land grabs. He wanted our property. When I refused to sell, he didn't argue. He just waited until I went into town for supplies. Clara felt a cold dread wash over her, sensing where the story was going. "They set fire to the house," Jedediah continued, his eyes turning hard and empty. "Claimed it was an accident, an errant spark from the chimney. I lost my wife. I lost my unborn child. The local law was bought and paid for. Sound familiar?" Clara reached across the table, her fingers gently brushing the rough, scarred back of his hand. "Oh, Jed, I'm so sorry. Was it Gentry?" "No," Jedediah said, his jaw clenching. "It was Gentry's father. The old man started the empire. The son is just expanding it." Jedediah turned his hand over, his large fingers gently wrapping around Clara's smaller ones. His touch was warm and grounding. "I spent 5 years tracking down the men who lit the match, handled them my own way. But by the time I finished, I wasn't fit for polite society anymore. So I came up here, let the mountains swallow me. Until a few days ago, I swore I'd never let another human being get close enough to matter." Clara looked into his pale gray eyes, seeing the profound loneliness that mirrored her own. "And now?" she whispered. "Now," Jedediah said, his gaze dropping to her lips for a fraction of a second before returning to her eyes, "I realize that hiding in the high country doesn't stop evil men from doing evil things to good people." Suddenly, Levi sat up from his bedroll near the fire. "Mr. Jed?" the boy asked, rubbing his tired eyes. "The dogs are crying." Jedediah froze. He didn't own dogs. He instantly released Clara's hand, his demeanor shifting from a vulnerable man to a lethal predator in a heartbeat. He stood up, silently crossing the room to the heavy window shutters. He peered through a tiny slit in the wood. Clara rushed over to the children, pulling them close, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Jed, what is it?" "Wolves," Jedediah muttered, but he was reaching for his heavy Sharps rifle resting above the mantel. "But they ain't crying at the moon. They're barking at horses. Someone is coming up the ridge." "Who would be out here after a blizzard?" Clara asked, panic rising in her throat. Jedediah checked the breech of his rifle, sliding a massive 50 caliber cartridge into place with a definitive clack. "Men who are very motivated," Jedediah said grimly. "When the storm broke, I went back down to your camp to retrieve any supplies you left behind. Your tent was gone, Clara. The snow had been dug up. Someone found your camp, realized you survived, and tracked my footprints through the snow before the blizzard covered them completely." Clara gasped. Gentry's men. "They're looking for that map," Jedediah said, walking to the door and throwing the heavy iron bolt into place. He turned to Clara, his eyes fierce and protective. "Hide the children in the root cellar under the rug. Do it now." "What are you going to do?" Clara asked, her voice trembling as she lifted Toby. "I'm going to teach them," Jedediah said, stepping out of the firelight and fading into the shadows near the door, his rifle raised, "that they shouldn't have climbed this high up my mountain." Clara didn't waste a single second. She threw back the heavy braided rug in front of the hearth, revealing a thick wooden trapdoor. Pulling it open with a frantic heave, she ushered her wide-eyed children down the rough-hewn ladder into the pitch-black root cellar. "Levi, hold your brother tight," Clara commanded, in a fierce whisper, pressing the infant into her oldest son's arms. "Abigail, cover your ears. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear up there. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Mama," Levi whispered, his voice trembling but remarkably resolute. Clara kissed their foreheads in the dark, then climbed back up, pulling the trapdoor shut and dragging the heavy rug over it just as a voice boomed from the snowy darkness outside. "Boone, we know you're in there!" The voice was harsh, grating like two rusted saw blades rubbing together. Jedediah stood motionless beside the heavy oak door, his Sharps rifle resting easily in his massive hands. He glanced at Clara, silently motioning for her to stay flat against the stone masonry of the fireplace, the thickest part of the cabin. "That's Cullen Boyd," Jedediah murmured, his gray eyes narrow and cold. "Gentry's chief enforcer. Man's a rabid dog in a suit." Outside, hoofbeats crunched loudly as half a dozen riders fanned out, forming a deadly semicircle around the cabin. "Listen to me, Boone," Boyd shouted over the howling wind. "We ain't got no quarrel with you. We're tracking a fugitive widow who stole company property from Mr. Harrison Gentry. Send the Higgins woman and her brats out, along with the ledger she took, and we'll ride back down the mountain. You try to play the hero, and we'll bury you right alongside her husband." Clara's breath hitched in her throat. The casual mention of Arthur's murder sent a spike of pure, unadulterated rage through her veins, momentarily drowning out her terror. Jedediah didn't shout back. He didn't believe in wasting breath on men who had already dug their own graves. He stepped up to the narrow gun slit carved into the thick logs next to the door. He raised the heavy rifle, sighting down the barrel. "Take cover," Jedediah said softly. Boom. The roar of the 50 caliber Sharps inside the cabin was deafening, shaking the dust from the rafters. Outside, a man screamed as the massive slug tore through his shoulder, knocking him clean out of his saddle. His horse reared, panicked by the thunderous shot and the smell of blood bolting into the tree line. "Fire!" Boyd shrieked, his voice cracking in panic and rage. "Light the cabin up!" A hail of lead slammed into the cabin. Bullets splintered the thick logs, shattered the heavy glass of the single-high window, and embedded themselves in the stone of the fireplace. Clara crouched low, covering her head with her arms as wood chips rained down like shrapnel. Jedediah moved with the terrifying speed and grace of a mountain cat, dropping the single-shot Sharps and pulling a Winchester repeating rifle from a rack on the wall. He fired methodically from different slits, cycling the lever action with deadly precision. Every time he pulled the trigger, a yell of pain or a frantic scramble of boots echoed from the snow. He was holding them off, but there were too many. Then a heavy thud struck the roof, followed by the sickening sound of shattering glass. Suddenly, a bright, unnatural orange glow illuminated the cabin's high vaulted ceiling. The smell of kerosene flooded the room, immediately followed by the acrid, choking stench of burning pine. "They threw a lantern on the roof!" Clara yelled over the gunfire. Jedediah froze. The repeating rifle slipped inches in his grip. He stared up at the spreading flames licking the ceiling beams. The crackling of the fire seemed to drown out the gunfire outside. To Clara's horror, the towering mountain man's eyes glazed over, his chest heaving as he stared into the inferno. He wasn't seeing the cabin. He was 15 years in the past, watching his home, his wife, and his life turn to ash. "Jed!" Clara screamed, coughing as the smoke began to thicken. She crawled across the floor, bullets thudding into the logs above her head, and grabbed his arm. "Jedediah! Look at me!" He didn't move. His breathing was rapid, trapped in the paralyzing grip of his darkest memory. Clara stood up, ignoring the whizzing bullets, and slammed her hands into his chest. "Jedediah Boone, you are not losing anyone to a fire tonight. Do you hear me? Look at me." Jedediah blinked, his pale gray eyes violently snapping back to the present. He looked down at Clara, her face smeared with soot, her eyes blazing with an indomitable will. The ghost of his past shattered under the weight of her fierce presence. "The cellar," Jedediah choked out, his voice returning to a gravelly roar. "Get the kids." Clara scrambled to the rug, throwing it aside and pulling the trapdoor open. Smoke was already pouring down into the darkness. "Levi! Up! Now!" Jedediah grabbed a heavy woolen blanket, dunked it entirely into a water barrel, and threw it over Clara and the children as they emerged, coughing and terrified. The roof groaned ominously, a burning beam crashing onto the dining table. "Where do we go?" Clara cried out. "If we run out the door, they'll shoot us down." "We aren't going out the door," Jedediah said, grabbing a heavy iron pry bar from the hearth. He moved to the back wall of the cabin, behind the massive stone fireplace. He jammed the bar into the mortar between two massive field stones and pulled with a roar of effort. The stones shifted. It was a false wall. Behind it lay the pitch-black maw of an old, forgotten mine shaft that Jedediah had built the cabin against. "In!" Jedediah ordered, shoving them into the damp, freezing darkness of the tunnel. Just as Jedediah slipped inside and pulled the stones back into place, the roof of the cabin caved in with a deafening crash, consuming the room in a raging inferno. The tunnel was narrow and smelled of ancient earth and damp rock. Jedediah struck a single match, shielding it with his massive hand to guide them. They walked for nearly 100 yards in terrifying silence, the roar of the fire muffled behind the stone. "This shaft opens up behind the ridge," Jedediah whispered, handing Clara the burnt match. "When we get out, stay in the tree line. Keep the children completely quiet." Clara grabbed his arm. "What are you going to do?" "Boyd thinks we burned to death in that cabin," Jedediah said softly, the lethal calm returning to his voice. "He and his men will be standing around the fire to keep warm, waiting for the ashes to cool so they can sift for Arthur's ledger. I'm going to introduce them to the ghost of Engineer Mountain." They reached the end of the shaft, obscured by thick, dead brush. As they stepped out into the biting cold, they could see the massive bonfire that used to be Jedediah's home, illuminating the night sky just over the ridge. Jedediah vanished into the trees without a sound. He didn't take a rifle. The gunshots would be too loud. He drew a massive, bone-handled hunting knife. Clara huddled with her children behind a thick cluster of spruce, praying into the dark. Down at the burning cabin, Cullen Boyd stood with his 3 remaining men, shivering in the cold, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames. "Boss, you think they survived that?" one of the thugs asked, rubbing his hands together. "Nobody survives that," Boyd sneered. "Soon as the embers die down, we find the widow's bones and get that book. Gentry wants this done by—" A wet, heavy thud interrupted him. Boyd turned. The man who had just spoken was gone. Only a drag mark in the snow led away into the dark pines. "What the hell?" Boyd whispered, drawing his revolver. "Spread out! Keep your eyes on the trees!" The remaining 2 men backed up, their guns raised. A shadow detached itself from the canopy above. Jedediah dropped silently behind the closest man, one massive arm wrapping around his neck and dragging him backward into the darkness before he could even utter a scream. Boyd spun around, firing wildly into the trees. "Show yourself, Boone! You cowardly son of a—" A heavy piece of firewood sailed out of the darkness, striking Boyd's remaining man squarely in the jaw. He went down in a heap. Boyd stood alone, his gun shaking, his eyes darting frantically. The wind howled, mocking him. "You brought fire to my home, Boyd," a deep, rumbling voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere at once. Boyd spun, but he was too slow. Jedediah emerged from the smoke like a vengeful titan. With a brutal swing of his arm, he knocked the revolver from Boyd's hand, the heavy barrel of his Winchester smashing into Boyd's ribs with a sickening crunch. Boyd collapsed to his knees, gasping for air, staring up at the terrifying mountain man. Jedediah pressed the barrel of the rifle to Boyd's forehead. "You're going to ride down to Durango. You're going to find a United States Marshal. Not the sheriff, a federal marshal. And you're going to tell him exactly what Harrison Gentry paid you to do to Arthur Higgins. If you don't, I will hunt you to the ends of the earth." Boyd, weeping and clutching his broken ribs, nodded frantically. "I'll tell him! I swear to God, I'll tell him everything!" "Get out of my sight," Jedediah growled. An hour later, the sun began to peek over the jagged peaks, casting a brilliant pink and gold light across the pristine snow. The cabin was reduced to smoldering logs and a blackened stone chimney, but Clara and the children were alive, wrapped in surviving blankets Jedediah had stashed in the mine shaft. Clara sat on a fallen log, staring at Arthur's journal in the morning light. She kept rereading the final, bloody sentence. "The map is hidden in the—" "I don't understand," Clara whispered, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. He didn't finish the sentence. "The map is lost." Jedediah sat down beside her, his massive presence a comforting anchor. "May I?" he asked gently. She handed him the book. Jedediah ran his thick fingers over the cracked leather cover. He inspected the spine, turning it over in the sunlight. "Arthur was a clever man," Jedediah murmured. "If he knew men were coming to kill him for this ledger, why would he leave the map inside the pages where anyone could rip it out?" Jedediah pulled his knife and carefully inserted the tip into the thick, glued binding of the leather spine. With a swift motion, he sliced the leather open. Clara gasped. Tucked perfectly inside the hollowed-out spine of the journal was a tightly rolled piece of parchment. Jedediah unfurled it. It was a detailed topographical map of Engineer Mountain, complete with assay figures and a massive red X's marking a quartz vein richer than anything struck in the last decade. It was millions of dollars in silver and gold. Clara covered her mouth, a sob tearing from her throat. Arthur had saved them. Even from the grave, he had provided for his family. "We need to get you to Denver," Jedediah said, looking at the map. "We go straight to the federal land office. Gentry can't touch you there." Clara looked up at Jedediah. The soot and ash on his face couldn't hide the deep, soulful relief in his gray eyes. She reached out, resting her hand against his rough cheek. "We?" Clara asked softly. "You're coming with us?" Jedediah leaned into her touch, his large hand gently covering hers. "I've spent 15 years hiding from the world, Clara. I thought my life ended in the ashes. But you and these children brought me back to life. I ain't letting you out of my sight. Not ever." 6 months later, the spring wildflowers were blooming in the valleys. In a bustling federal courthouse in Denver, Harrison Gentry was sentenced to hang for racketeering and the murder of Arthur Higgins, thanks to a full confession from a terrified Cullen Boyd. The Higgins claim became one of the most profitable mines in Colorado history. But Clara didn't return to the mountains to dig. She bought a massive, sprawling ranch on the plains just outside Denver. On a warm Sunday afternoon, Clara stood on the wraparound porch of her new home, watching Levi and Abigail chase a pair of spotted hounds across the green grass. Toby was perched high on the broad shoulders of Jedediah Boone, who was laughing a deep, joyful rumble that rolled across the prairie. Jedediah, dressed in clean denim and a respectable cotton shirt, walked up to the porch, setting Toby down to run with his siblings. He stepped up beside Clara, wrapping his massive arms around her waist from behind and resting his chin on her shoulder. "It's peaceful today," Jedediah murmured, pressing a soft kiss to her temple. "It is," Clara smiled, leaning back against the solid, unbreakable mountain of a man who had saved her life, and whose life she had saved in return. We finally have our roof, Jedediah. What a breathtaking journey of survival, justice, and the unstoppable power of love in the unforgiving, wild West. Clara and Jedediah's story proves that even in our darkest, coldest moments, hope can emerge from the shadows to guide us home. Sometimes the fiercest monsters aren't the beasts in the woods, but the greed in men's hearts, and it takes the courage of a mother and the strength of a broken mountain man to defeat them. If this harrowing tale of the Colorado frontier kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button and share this story with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss another thrilling, true-to-life historical saga. What was your favorite twist in Clara's story?
Hi, my name is Mountain Secrets, the owner and manager of Mountain Secrets. After watching the video, she was raising 3 kids in a tent. The mountain man said, "You'll sleep under a roof tonight." I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the quiet strength Clara carried through every part of the story. Even when she had almost nothing left, she kept fighting for her children. And Jedediah's kindness felt powerful because it came without conditions or promises, just a simple decision to help when someone truly needed it. I also think this story reminds us how much a single act of compassion can change the direction of someone's life. Have you ever had a moment where a stranger helped you when you felt completely lost? And what part of Clara and Jedediah's journey stayed with you the longest? Sometimes people don't need grand gestures. They just need someone willing to stand beside them during the hardest season of their life. If this story meant something to you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy these mountain stories, you're always welcome to like and subscribe for more.
Hi, my name is Robert Bowen, the owner and manager of Rugged Heart Man. After watching the video, she was raising 3 kids in a tent. The mountain man said, "You'll sleep under a roof tonight." I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the feeling of compassion and hope. At its heart, this story is about someone recognizing another person's struggle and choosing to help when it mattered most. Those moments of kindness can be powerful, especially when they offer comfort and security during difficult times. One gentle lesson from this story is that sometimes the simplest acts of generosity can make the biggest difference. A helping hand, a safe place, or a little understanding can mean more than we realize. Do you think the mountain man's offer changed more than just their circumstances? And which moment in the story stood out to you the most? In our everyday lives, we may not be able to solve every problem, but we can still look for opportunities to support the people around us. Small acts of care often leave a lasting impact. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy these heartfelt mountain stories, feel free to like and subscribe for more from Rugged Heart Man.